heresy is like a tree. Its roots lie in darkness, while its leaves wave in the sun. You can prune away its branches, even cut the tree to the ground, but it will grow again, ever stronger. Such is the nature of heresy, and why it is so difficult to destroy. Some may question my right to destroy a world of 10 billion souls. But those who truly understand realize that I have no right to let them live. No sacrifice is too great. No treachery too small.
It is not often that you're going to hear about what I'm going to speak about. In fact, the knowledge of what I'm about to go over is something you'd be far better off not knowing. It's knowledge that few would actually want to admit. The last time I spoke to you like this, I told you about who we are as humans, where we come from. Today, I'm going to talk about the very thing we can't escape from. The one thing we can't rid ourselves of. It's the poisoned well we drank from, the tainted meat that we eat, the polluted air that we breathe. The very thing that makes us human fuels it. The very essence of our soul is tied to it. The biggest threat to our existence, yet deny it to us and we would not be who we are. It surrounds us, binds us to it, and should it feed, should it grow, should it rear its head suddenly with conviction, there is nothing we should not do to eliminate its threat. Understand this. As you listen to me, you're going to learn things that would warrant the death of planets to know. You may have heard of the Inquisition, the Imperium's watchdog organization. You may have heard that it overreacts, that it sanctions the death of worlds on a whim, that it kills billions of innocents to punish a few hundred. Rest assured, if you had put my finger on the trigger, if you had put my hand on the lever, if it were my world that would condemn a world to death, I'd do it as well, without hesitation. I would scour a world of anything capable of thought. Why? Because the great enemy, chaos, is the most dangerous threat we have ever faced. It's a persistent enemy, one that's always there, whispering in the back of our minds. It offers peace for the tired and sick. It offers excitement to those lost in the mundane, strength to the weak, and change to those who would revolutionize. It offers respite, and that which you would never have. And in the morass that is the Imperium, it is so very tempting. In the Imperium, the existence of chaos is kept so closely guarded that to even know of what I'm saying now is enough to seal your fate. The Imperial man does not tolerate even the most basic information about this threat to be spread. The wider Imperium is kept completely in ignorance of the horrors I'm going to speak of. The reason for this is simple, yet complicated. To explain this, I have to explain chaos. The parasitic realm attached to our own, the Immaterium, feeds off every emotion and action that has existed since the first single-celled organism registered the first sensation. Ever since that time, in the dawning of life in the universe, the warp has slowly yet steadily fed on psychic energy that is fed to it. All life feeds the warp. Ever since the very first impulse that drove organic life, it has fed, from a lizard snatching a fly, to evolution itself, all the way to the cataclysmic wars that have rocked the galaxy to its foundation. The amount of energy is subjective to how powerful the spirit of any species is within the Immaterium. It might come as a surprise to you to learn that the warp itself is naturally placid. Its surface, if you could call it such, is naturally calm, without the massive turbulence that exists today. In any sane galaxy it would be. In any sane galaxy it should be. I think it goes without saying our galaxy is far from sane. The warp, as I have said, is a parasite. Like any parasitic organism, it looks to feed on whatever can provide it with the most energy. Over billions of years, the warp has created its own offspring, lesser versions of itself, all part of the greater whole. Time is meaningless in the Sea of Souls, yet time is vital. That which did not exist until yesterday has always existed. That which was destroyed never was to begin with. It's confusing, I know. Paradoxes within paradoxes. But when it comes to the Immaterium, the first thing to realize is that the gods within it have always been there. Always. Are they really gods? The answer is yes, and the answer is no. It's very easy to attribute these terms to the creatures in the warp. As for some, that is exactly what they are. They can influence our reality, create storms in the warp so violent they break the veil between reality and their unreality. Their offspring, what we call demons, can enter our reality given enough energy exists to sustain them. Are they really gods, though? Well, no. They are as much of a deity as a leech grown to enormous proportions, but not much more than that. They don't have what we would call a higher sentience, not as we would know it, nor the ability to plan for the future, not as we would readily comprehend. These four creatures we call the Chaos Gods exist as any parasitic life form does, and just like a parasite that has been given the chance to grow unchecked, it will eventually kill its host from its ravenous feeding. Just like any predator, they will discover ways to find more food, continue to grow, to feed, until the very thing that sustains it dies. They are nothing more than patterns formed in the deep sea of the Immaterium, a groove worn into reality, one that repeats itself over and over, tearing ever deeper until existence snaps. As they feed, they grow. They grow in the power they can project. They grow in the strength they can manifest, and the ways they can influence reality. It wasn't always like this. We as humans sometimes delude ourselves with notions that we had some major influence on these creatures' development, but really they have existed from the dawn of all things. From the first time a single-celled organism killed another single-celled organism, the creature known as Khorne has existed. From the first time that a being enjoyed sensation, Sladesh. When the strings of evolution began to cause mutations and change, Tzeentch. And from the first death, Nurgle. These four entities at one point served a purpose. And in their own way they assisted humanity, if not every species, on its development. To explain this, I need to give examples and context. We call Nurgle the god of decay, disease, and death, but Nurgle represents far more than that. Nurgle represents both life, death, and the life cycle itself. The same emotions and actions that fuel Nurgle are that of a parent having a child, the child growing and having children of their own and eventually dying. Nurgle is forests and trees, swamps and jungles, single-celled amoebas to walking titans of flesh and bone. Nurgle is nothing more or less than nature itself. Removing Nurgle would be the removal of the entire life cycle of creation. We call Khorne the blood god who sits on a throne of skulls, who doesn't care from where the blood comes, only that it comes. Khorne is more than just a butcher god. Khorne represents survival of the fittest, morality, fairness, martial honor, justice, and strength not only of body but of character. Without Khorne's influence, natural order simply breaks down at a fundamental level. Out of the four, Khorne represents order more than any of them, representing the force needed to establish a society out of lawlessness through strength alone. We call Tzeentch the Changer of Ways, who grants his followers sorceress powers, but not all change is bad. Without him, there would be no reforms, no new ideas, schemes, and no push to notice things that aren't right and need to be changed in the first place. Tzeentch's evolution, not only of physical forms, but also ideas. We call Slaanesh the Prince of Pain, she who thirsts, and the Lord of Excess. Slaanesh is also sensation, joy, despair, attraction, creativity, and sadness. Slaanesh draws power from this, as well as other aspects of the other three. Khorne may influence the warrior and draw power from that warrior defeating an enemy, but the satisfaction of defeating the enemy also feeds Slaanesh. Nurgle represents and draws power from diseases that infect, but the despair of the sick also fuels Slaanesh. Tzeentch may influence a revolution in a nation, but the thrill of it also belongs to Slaanesh. Slaanesh could be considered to be made of raw emotion, and influence is the same in others. None of this sounds particularly bad. As a matter of fact, none of it is particularly an evil thing. In fact, in many cases, what makes life worth living is bound to these four beings. This is why they exist, these emotions and actions that are made from life and the things that give life structure as well as meaning. These four beings, the gods of chaos, provide the means and influence for these sensations to be felt, for these actions to be carried through, for the parent to cry tears of joy or sadness, for the warrior to find his honor and keep it close. On knowing this, the first question is why? Why is the Immaterium, why is chaos considered the great enemy? What could be so threatening about this? About the Immaterium itself? None of this sounds evil. At worst, it's purely neutral. So what is it? What makes these four so dangerous? What is it that makes chaos itself so dangerous? The fuel of these warp entities, these chaos gods, are actions, events, and raw emotion. The more powerful the emotion, the stronger the response of others to what has happened, the more food that is produced. The more connected psychically to the warp the individual is, the more energy is created. The Immaterium is parasitic, and a parasite does not moderate itself. It will not slow itself down nor stop out of a sense of propriety or planning for the future. The parasite will continue to feed, it will continue to grow, and it will not stop feeding voraciously as long as it continues to be fed. No amount of fuel is never enough. No amount ever sates them. The more extreme, the more devastating, the more horrifying, the more treacherous. The parasite doesn't care how damaged the host is, it simply realizes that more food comes when conditions are met, then seeks to make more of those conditions. An echo that constantly refrains, and with each reverberation twists and distorts until it drowns out everything else. The warp, since the collapse of the galaxy-spanning human civilization, has been flooded with every manner of horror that has done nothing but gorge these creatures to bursting. Prior to the start of the Age of Strife, the warp was becoming more and more turbulent due to the actions of the Aldari Empire. Depraved acts of the purest hedonism, the complete disregard for restraint, and the pursuit of nothing but pure sensation, from a species so psychically gifted that in the warp they appear as bonfires to our candles. It threw the warp into abject anarchy. When the Age of Strife began in earnest, the feeding frenzy of the Chaos Gods began in earnest, and it has never truly stopped. Genocides wiped out entire planets in bloody warfare, from the highest echelons of power to the beggar on the streets, to survivment, to change and adapt, to scheme and plot. Devastating plagues ravaged the stars from one end of the galaxy to the other end of the galaxy, wiping out entire populations and bathing worlds in fear and horror. All the while the Aldari Empire continued to descend into further and further debauchery. I have said before, and I will say it again, the beings in the warp have always existed, and yet haven't. Names are powerful things. To name a thing is to label it, and while an action or emotion alone feeds the warp, belief and worship performing those same set actions in the name of a being? That is where true potency lies. Granted, names have been given to gods who filled the same purpose as the four, but to worship them, that is something else entirely. As knowledge of the Chaos Gods spread in the darkness and strife, a torrent of power gave them strength. An energy they had gained from the actions and emotions pouring into the Immaterium was nothing compared to the absolute flood that came when humans and Xenos alike started invoking their names. Through whispers in the dark places of the mind, the four made themselves known. Cults started rising on world after world, even Terra itself, dedicated to the worship of these entities of the warp. Worship is the key. To perform an action alone means very little in the warp. A drop of water. Enough drops and you have a lake. Enough lakes and you have an ocean, the Sea of Souls. Worship, however, dedicating an act or an action in the name of, that isn't a drop of water at all. That's like a wave. Belief gave them rules, rituals, rites, and symbolism that all carry their own significance. Belief gave them the ability to project their power beyond whispers and urges. Belief gave them the ability to bathe planets in their influence, to corrupt based off proximity to their symbols, to override and to possess. Belief gave them power, the likes of which they had never experienced before. A deluge of the rawest and most extreme actions and emotions surged into the Immaterium. Plagues of Nurgle turned verdant paradises into swamps infested with disease. Warriors charged into the defenseless with blades and axes, screaming blood for the Blood God. Psychers dominated entire planets for the Lord of Change, and the Eldari society began to hear a name that just came to them as they pushed the boundaries of sensation and excess, joy and agony, bliss and suffering even further. The Eldari's actions thundered into the Sea of Souls as the very fabric of reality quaked. Finally, in the Immaterium, after millennia of being drowned in a sea of pure emotion, something that had not existed but had always existed finally blinked. As the Age of Strife reached its peak, as the Emperor brought Terra fully under his command, the warp finally hit critical mass, becoming so bloated and volatile the barrier between real space and the Immaterium was torn asunder. For thousands of light years, the Immaterium ripped into the fabric of real space, creating an open wound in the galaxy that has never closed. The Eye of Terror. A psychic scream thundered from the newly awakened Slanesh to devour the majority of the Eldari, ripping their souls away from them in this instance of cataclysmic birth. The massive warp storms that had existed for thousands of years were blasted by a shockwave of pure psychic force, making travel to the Immaterium dangerous, but actually manageable for the first time in millennia. The Great Crusade of mankind was a race against time more than anything. It was a race against time against creatures that reside in a timeless space. It was the attempt to cut these creatures off from the main wellspring of power, worship, and belief. Are these beings intelligent? Oh yes, very much so. They have been around since the dawn of creation, and they know very well how we work, what we desire. In many ways, the beings of the warp know us better than we know ourselves. They know what we want, they know what motivates us, because those things are the very aspects of their nature. Any hope we had of ending the threat of chaos ended with the event that terminated the Great Crusade, and the warp has continued to feed almost unabated. Unending wars of survival, diseases that wipe out entire planets, endless rebellions and revolutions, as well as the pleasure cults dedicated to escaping the misery of the last 10,000 years, they are all constant. The energies of these conflicts pour unchecked and unceasing into the Immaterium, and the parasites within, these chaos gods, are not content with the feast of power and souls they have devoured so recklessly so far. During the Age of Strife, they learned to tempt, to influence, to use their power to corrupt. True, Tzeentch could cause a pure revolution of ideas to sweep across the galaxy. It could use this influence to pull the galaxy into a peaceful coexistence through non-violent revolutions and subtle planning. Khorne could invest the galaxy with an upsurging and urging for a strict martial code, banding the more civilized groups against the dangerous Xenos by using their shared warrior ethos. Nurgle could wave his hand and turn the blasted worlds and wastelands into lush paradises beyond the wildest dreams of the most ancient of species, and Slaanesh could usher in a culture of artisans and musicians to bathe the galaxy in beauty and shared passions. But that would require the gods of chaos to be what they are called. Gods. Instead, there is nothing but the gnashing hunger of them, these parasites, who has spent the better part of 15,000 years experiencing the entire galaxy, projecting the most extreme energies into the depths of the warp. And why would parasites wish to slow their gluttony to cull which they desire and need? They only ever want more. Have you ever wondered why the Inquisition acts with such a heavy hand once chaos is discovered? Why an entire planet can burn over the actions of a small few? It's because that small few can usher in an apocalypse. With rituals whispered to their ignorant and eager ears, those few could summon a storm of power that would wash over unprotected minds. Those few could bathe the planet in the worst aspects of their god, creating a horror that could easily be spread, could easily multiply, and an infection that could swallow an entire sector and more, and bathe all of it in the purest hells your mind could imagine. The only saving grace is that once a world becomes infested with a warp, it's not going to be long before the entire population tears itself apart, drowning in a sea of its own blood. Chaos turns upon itself given enough time and burns out. But the threat of that infection spreading is enough to warrant the death of billions to prevent it from spreading. It feeds upon itself, so the smallest of cracks can end up toppling the greatest of empires. The more it acts, the more it can act, until a critical point is crossed and it can spread no more, crashing down and tearing itself apart. The taint of chaos starts innocently enough, but it has two critical mass points. There will be a single person who first is afflicted, who finds himself suddenly taken in by some new knowledge, some new sensation or behavior. They'll start amassing a small following. At this point, most times they don't even know where this chain of events will eventually lead. Invariably, left alone, this small group will begin showing signs of ritualistic behavior. Again, it starts off innocently enough. A shared drink, a few spoken words at the start and end of a meeting, a hand gesture among members. These behaviors become commonplace, regular, and expand in meaning and significance. When the first utterances of their patron's name are spoken, it may seem strange. It may have come from a book. It may have come from a dream. This is the first critical point, where the band of friends becomes a cult. The cult will expand slowly, drawing more disaffected members in and inducting them. The rituals that started off so innocently have become more complex, more involved. Eventually, it begins to involve blood, sacrifices, self-harm, or other actions taken that would have appalled the cultists not months prior. The cult may only be a few dozen strong, hundreds maybe, but the wary watcher will start noticing signs that something is wrong. People will go missing. There will be a general unease close to their centers of worship. Rituals become more ruthless. This gradual possession, the build-up to the second critical point, is usually found out. Imperial Inquisitors will be dispatched, and the cult is usually cut out, root and stem, and burned like the infection that it is. The Inquisition is very comprehensive about this. In many eyes, they overstep the need. Not in mine. The Inquisition knows what comes should the cult survive and reach that final critical point. It's the point where the cult summons a demon, summons a patron from their chosen deity. The infection of chaos, localized and mostly contained by need, suddenly and explosively expands. hive cities descend into open warfare, exposed and unprepared population lose their minds and themselves, devolving into scenes of abject hell. An entire planet can be overwhelmed and overrun in mere days, with most never even seeing it coming. You have never seen horror until you've seen a world lost to chaos. You've never seen the depravity, the brutality, the acts of absolute cruelty. I'm not gonna go into detail, and that's for a good reason. You'd never sleep again in the knowledge of what people will do to lifelong friends, family members, and lovers when the taint of chaos is upon them. You'd never question the actions of the Inquisition again when they wipe out entire towns, hives, and planetary populations. Such things are mercies. Thinking on some of the things I've seen, I often wonder, is this what the Eldari devolved into before the Immaterium swallowed them? Or is this just a twisted mockery? After seeing only one such planet and knowing that if left unchecked the infection would spread, I don't even flinch hearing acts of genocide being carried out by the Inquisition. You'd be thanking them on your knees if you weren't wrapped up in the delusion of your own morality! You'd think this would stop the denizens of the warp, that they would keep their actions more subtle, more controlled, and that the restraint would be employed to sustain the very population that feeds it. You'd think this would stop the constant attempts of the Chaos Gods to break through, to consume the galaxy in their own hunger. You'd think this, but this is not the case. They are only creatures of immense power driven by the need to amass more. Some might say because these creatures can communicate with us, because they can understand our desires. That means they must be sentient or self-aware. This is a misreading of the way that they work and the way the Immaterium functions. Over millennia, these parasites have learned new ways to get the energy that sustain them, and now, just like a biological response, they hunt for new sources of food to continue to feed. Reckless, without restraint, because there are no restraints to put on them. They would feed off every soul voraciously, even if they killed every living thing in existence in the process. That is what makes them so dangerous. That is what makes them the greatest enemy we have. Like entitled addicts, these beings are now gorged and gluttonous, using every trick and turn they have developed simply to gain more food, more energy. No matter what gets destroyed, no matter how many die in the process, no matter if the next hit is literally their last.